All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to our first YouTube live stream training. My name is Randall Eby, and we're going to be covering the express and auto filtration, talking about your LOV and your Evolution Elite fryers today. Some of the topics that we're going to cover is going to be your express, your auto filtration, as well as your daily maintenance filter. And also we're going to jump into the filter pan maintenance. So at the end of this training, we're going to save roughly about 5 minutes to get your questions answered for you. So throughout the training, be thinking of those. So the first topic that we're going to cover is going to be the express or the auto filtration. So throughout the day, your fryer is, as you cook throughout the day, the cook drops will go down in number. So with that being said, it's going to ask you to filter now throughout the day as those drop down. So the key thing we want to remember is when it does that, we always want to select yes to filter now. Now, the reason that's important and we don't want to skip or hit no is because there's several things that can happen from that. So one of those things will be as throughout the day, as we're continuing to cook and crumbs are building up in here, as we continue to add product, one of the things that can happen if we're skipping those filters is those crumbs can accumulate in the bottom of the fry pot and build up and eventually clog this drain valve when we do go to do our filtration. This is a big thing that we want to avoid because what can happen there is that can lead to costly service calls if we end up getting our drain brush stuck in here, which some of you may be familiar with. And the reason for that is the control opens this drain valve for a certain amount of time. And if there's a bunch of crumbs built up in here that's collected from skipping filters, what can happen is that gets clogged. We have to then go get our drain brush to clear that obstruction. And then the control will go ahead and close after a certain amount of time. And if we have that drain brush caught in there, then this is where that can get stuck and then lead to costly service calls. Also with that, you can see here that we have our skimming tool that we definitely want to make sure that we use at the beginning of each auto or express filter. And what we would do there is we would just simply skim off that top layer of product or crumbs and then dispose of them in the trash can so that we could get rid of that. And that's also going to contribute to not allowing our drain valve to get clogged up. The other thing we want to keep in mind with that is also, as we had talked about those crumbs being in our fry pot, the other thing that it's also doing at the same time is it's greatly reducing the oil life. So as those crumbs continue to sit in here, if we are skipping filters throughout the day, maybe it's during our lunch rush, what's happening there is the fry pot is the fryer is continuing to cook. So therefore, all those crumbs laying in here are continuing to cook and burn. And what that's doing is it's reducing the quality of our product coming out because those crumbs are continuing to be cooked and it transfers that burnt taste into the product, at the same time also reducing the life of our oil. So this is a big reason why we always want to select yes to filter now and that we don't want to skip. Our goal throughout each and every day should be 0 skips when it comes to express or auto filtration. So now that we talked about a couple of those things, what we want to do, and a great tip to be proactive in this measure, to have to keep from even potentially skipping a filter, is something that we can do throughout the day before we go into our lunch rush or maybe our dinner rush, is we can simply walk by each and every one of our control panels here, whether we have a 3-vat or a 4-vat, and we can just simply press this F button on each one of our control panels like so, and it's going to tell us how many cook drops we have left. So we'll take a closer look at that. And as I mentioned, if we push this F button, you can see here it tells me cooks remain 10. And if we take a look at our McDonald's unit, if we press our F button, it's going to tell me that I have 12 cooks remain. Now, that will just depend on your pre-programmed measures in terms of your control on how many cooks you have pre-programmed, so you may see more with different customers. But the neat thing about this is, like I had mentioned, if we're going into our lunch rush and we want to, our goal is 0 filter skips, what we can do to minimize the potential of the fryer asking us to go ahead and filter now, and it's during our busy time and we don't want to, what we can do is before that lunch rush, like I mentioned, we can walk by here, hit that. If we see this number at like 1 or 2, what we can do proactively is we can come in here and go ahead and tell it to do an express or an auto filter. And we just press and hold that F button to go into the filter menu. So for McDonald's units, it's going to be the exact same process by pressing and holding that F button. It takes us into our filter menu. And then we would just simply press this #1 check mark to go ahead and start that auto or that express filter process. And then after it's done, the great thing is once it's done and we come back in here and we hit that F button again, now it has completely reset my available amount of cook drops. So going into our lunch rush now, excuse me, we have the most available amount of cook drops. And the great thing about this is this helps reduce that potential of it asking us to filter now. And we all know how much of an inconvenience it can be during those lunch rushes to have to do that filtration. So this is something we can do as a measure to be proactive and help reduce that. Something that goes hand in hand with that is also after we've reset all of our filter cook drop, or after we have reset all of our cook drops by going ahead and doing a express or auto filter, what we can do in addition to that to really reduce that amount is we can stagger our loads throughout those busy times, whether it be lunch or dinner rush. And what I mean by stagger is if we have 10 cook drops available on all 4 of these fryers going into our lunch rush, instead of consistently dropping the same product in, let's just say vat #1, for example, because it may be closest to your dump station, what we can do is instead of dropping the product in that same vat each time, we can stagger that amongst the other fryers. So what that does is it spreads those cook drops out through all of the fryers. And then it's a very likely chance that we could potentially go through a lunch rush without having to filter at all. So if we keep in mind, if we have 10 cook drops available for each vat, that's potential 40 cook drops to go through our lunch with possibly not having to filter. So that's something that we can keep in mind with being proactive in terms of helping reduce that possibility of having to skip a filter, which we don't want to do. Because if we do, then like we had talked before, it just leads to things such as clogged drain valves, which can potentially lead to getting a drain brush stuck in there, and then also creating a costly service call. But what we have to keep in mind as well is at the same exact time that's happening with those crumbs building up down there, it's also reducing our oil life. So oil is a very costly thing. So if we're doing all those things, making sure we're skimming that vat, doing our express or auto filtrations as it asks us to, and we have 0 skips, it's going to really help extend that oil life. So with that being said, we're going to jump into the daily maintenance filter and talk about a little bit of the key areas that we want to pay attention to when we're doing those. So we'll jump over here. So you can see here, we have an electric Evolution Elite 100 series. Over here, we have our gas 200 series, which you'll be probably pretty familiar with. And then over here, we have our McDonald's 200 series electric fryers, which will just be very slightly different in terms of layout. We will have our probes up at the front, and then we have an additional one back here. But the important part is we have 2 high limit probes right here, 1 on each element. And when we start our day off, we want to start that day off with a clean filter pad when we go to do our daily maintenance filter, or if we're doing that at the end of the night, whichever that may be. But when we're doing our daily maintenance filter, the key thing that we want to pay attention to when we're cleaning the inside of this vat with our cleaning tools, throughout that maintenance filter is if we pay a little extra attention to these areas, such as the probes and making sure there's not a bunch of crumb buildup or black carbon buildup, and especially if we can see here, our high limits that I had just mentioned, we want to make sure that we give a little extra attention to detail here, because if we do, we're going to prevent that black carbon from building up. And that is a really enemy for many reasons. It reduces the oil life. And also, if we get too much black carbon buildup on these components, it can lead to nuisance high limit errors. So coming back over to our other fryers, you can see here that we have our high limit on our Evolution Elite 100 series right here in the center. So we want to pay extra attention to that while also trying to clean the elements, and we have our probes up front here. Now on our gas units, we have all three of our probes up front here. So we would just want to make sure that we use our cleaning brushes to clean those a little bit. Keep in mind, we don't want to use anything that is abrasive that could ruin the finish on these, because then what's going to happen is those crumbs and that black carbon buildup is just going to stick to that even worse. And then on our gas models, of course, we want to make sure that we're trying to keep our burners and everything clean, but also right here, we have our high limit that sits right on top of our burner tube. So if we pay a little extra attention to that area, this will help keep from that black carbon buildup building up and causing those E10 high limit errors. So also with that, when we're doing our daily maintenance filter and we're paying a little extra attention to these areas, it also helps us when it comes time to do our clean outs or our deep cleans with degreaser, because what that's going to do is it's going to set us up for success, and it's going to make that deep clean or that clean out with degreaser very efficient, because we don't have a lot of black carbon buildup leading up into that point. So when we go to do those, it's going to reduce that black carbon buildup even more, and it's going to make it so much easier to get that cleaned off. So what we want to keep in mind with the daily maintenance filters is this is a time that we can use to pay a little extra attention to those areas, because the number one contributing factor to E10 high limit errors is going to be that black carbon buildup. While sometimes if we receive those errors, we may think that a component is faulty and may require a service call, while sometimes it's just a matter of cleanliness and getting that black carbon buildup off of those components. Because what it does is it creates a false or an inaccurate reading, and the control therefore gives that E10 high limit error. So if you're seeing some E10 high limit errors in your stores on some of your controls, and you take a look on the inside of your fry vats and you see that there's a good bit of black carbon buildup, there's a good chance that that's why that's causing that. So again, if we pay a little attention when we're doing our daily maintenance filter, and then especially when we're doing our clean out or our deep cleans with degreaser, this is a great time to just go ahead and get rid of that, and then we likely will not see those nuisance high limit errors. So we've talked about express filtration a little bit. We talked about daily maintenance. The last thing we're going to jump into is filter pan maintenance and what we can expect and look for there. So let's take a look at that. So over here, we have our two filter pans. This is going to be the most common one that you're going to see on Evolution Elites as well as LOV models. This one here we have, you can tell, has a little wider base. This is going to be for Wendy's electric units. So keep in mind, however, this filter pan is slightly different in its shape. The internal components are the same and are going to go together the exact same as the one we're going to demonstrate on here. So the only difference is the slightly wider base, and then also, if we can see here, we have a different color O-rings. Those are a different part number and a different size from our 200 series. Now, these O-rings will be found on 100 series electric units, no matter which customer that's for. So just be sure to make sure that you order the right ones if you go to replace those. And when we talk about filter pan maintenance, The three crucial things for filter pan maintenance are going to be a properly assembled filter pan, which we're going to demonstrate on how to do that. We also need to make sure that we have a clean filter pad. And that's going to be done at least once a day. Depending on how high volume your store is, you may need to find that that has to be changed twice a day, or at bare minimum, you may need to scrape your pad in order to keep that crumb buildup from being on top of that filter pad, because if we have too much, the oil won't be able to pull, or excuse me, the filter pump won't be able to pull that oil through that clogged filter pad. And then the last thing for filter pan maintenance is going to be our filter pan O-rings, which we're going to get in depth more here in just a moment. So let's take a look at what the inside of our filter pan looks like and how we would assemble that. So we will first take off our filter pan cover, set this to the side. Then we're going to have our crumb catcher. And an important note with a crumb catcher, when we go to empty these, it's okay to flip it upside down and shake it out over top of the trash can. But what we want to keep from doing is tapping that on the trash can, because what happens is these corners right here will break apart, and then this would end up having to be replaced. And it is crucial that it is inside the filter pan. So if you see in your store that it's missing this component, you want to make sure that you get one of these ordered. But keep in mind, like I had mentioned, if you see someone tapping it on a trash can to get that crumb buildup out of there, it's going to ruin these, and these are quite expensive. So we'll go ahead and get that out of the way. And then the next item we have is going to be our hold down bar. Now this is a weighted hold down bar, and it keeps our filter pad underneath of it sealed around all the edges so that no crumbs can get underneath that filter pad. So we'll set this off to the side, and then we have our filter pad. And this, to simulate in what we would see in the store, of course this would be heavily soiled with crumb buildup. We would go ahead and dispose of this, and I'm going to set this off to the side. And then our last component is going to be our woven filter screen. Now this needs to be cleaned as well. It should be pretty clean. We really shouldn't see any crumbs in here, but it is important that if so, we are spraying that off at likely our 3-comp sink and get all that off. And we'll go ahead and set that off to the side. And now that we have our filter pan empty, you can see our drain hole in the bottom here. So in the event that, let's say, someone accidentally put together the filter pan incorrectly, or maybe they forgot to put the filter pad in altogether, we want to make sure that this drain hole here in the bottom does not get clogged up with crumbs, because if it does, that in turn is going to go right into our filter pump motor, and it's going to wreak havoc on our filtering system, and then it's going to likely end up leading to a service call. So now that I have this apart, this is also a good time, if needed, this can be sprayed out and wiped out. And now that we have this apart, we'll take a closer look at our O-rings right here. You can see that there are 3 of them. I cannot emphasize enough how crucial these are to the overall success of filtration, whether it be express filtration or daily maintenance filtration. It is imperative that all 3 of these O-rings are on here and that they're also in good shape. If you see any that are flat or cut, ripped, or maybe even missing, even if it's only one missing, they need to be replaced. Also with that, we do recommend to replace these every 90 days. They're a very inexpensive part that you can have on hand, and if you see them ripped or torn or missing, it's a great time to go ahead and replace those. When we're doing our daily maintenance filter, it's a great time to go ahead and take a look at those and inspect them. And I'll quickly show how easy it is to change. Now keep in mind, anytime we're doing any of this filter pan maintenance, we want to make sure that we have the proper PPE wear, because these can be a potential burn risk. So we want to make sure that ideally we're doing this when the pan is cool, and especially when we go to change our O-rings. But I will go ahead and insert my screwdriver kind of underneath this O-ring, and then I'm just going to fold it. I'm just going to fold it over the side like so. And then you can see that I have my first O-ring removed. Now I would go ahead and do that same process for the next 2. but we're just going to simulate and replacing those. So then I would take my new O-ring and I would just simply roll it over that pickup tube. Now, the great part is once you put that first one on, when you go to replace the second two, you can just roll right over top of that first one that you installed and get your second one, and then so on with your third one. If you don't remember how to do this, be sure to check out our YouTube help channel as we have instructional videos for this process. So we'll go ahead and bring this back up here, and we will talk about going back together. So as I had mentioned, while we have this apart, we could go ahead and take this time to clean the inside of the filter pan. But what is very important is we want to make sure that this filter pan is dry before we go back together. Because just like heat is an enemy of oil, so is salt, so is water, and so is soap. So we want to make sure that this is dry. We can wipe it out or let it air dry depending on how much time we have. But then this is where we could go back together with our filter pan assembly. Here's our woven filter screen. We talked about cleaning it off as well. So we want to make sure that this is dry, whether it's wiped down or whether it's air dried. We want to make sure that this is dry as well. Now, one quick tip I would like to show everybody is these two components often get confused on how they go together in the filter pan. It is crucial that this woven filter screen goes down first. And the reason being is because if someone places the filter pad first and then the filter screen on top of it, what is going to happen when we go to put that back together and we go to do our first filtration is it's going to act just like a clogged filter pad. And the reason being is this filter screen has to be underneath of this filter pad in order for it to work properly. Otherwise, that filter pad is just going to clog this hole in the bottom like we had talked about before. So, as I had mentioned, we would put this filter screen in first, nice and dry. Then we would go ahead and proceed with our filter pad. Here we have a Henny Penny Smart filter paper, which you can see is pretty thin. And then for McDonald's LOV units, we will have a little thicker filter pad. And the neat thing about these is it even tells you this side up. So that is an important note for LOV models that we want to make sure that this side is up and it tells us clearly. So we would be able to set that in like so. And then last, we also have for our Wendy's units, they're going to require this pleated style filter pad. So this is where we would go ahead and insert that. Set these off to the side. So we would go ahead and set our filter pad in like so. And then we're going to proceed with our weighted hold down bar, which is going to seal that filter pan on the inside. It's going to seal all those edges to prevent any crumbs from getting underneath there. Because if we ever get any crumbs on the underside of this filter pad, they're going to go right down that drain hole, right up this pickup tube, and straight into our filter pump, and it's going to likely end up causing a service call. And we don't want that to happen because those can get costly. So we want to make sure that we have that assembled like so. Then we're going to take our crumb catcher. And again, we want to make sure that this is dry because water is going to be an enemy of oil. We'll go ahead and set that in like so. And then we have, last but not least, we have our filter pan cover. And just as all those other components are important, we also want to make sure that we have our cover in place, because if we don't have this cover in place, what's going to happen is when that oil comes gushing out of the drain trough and down into our filter pan, if this cover is not in place, it's going to splash out all over the place, and it's going to cause problems for us as well. Some of the things we could see there would be change pad messages or check pan, because our drain switch is down by this filter pan as well. And if that oil is splashing up on that switch, then it could cause problems. So we want to make sure that we have our filter pan cover in place. Another neat tip is on the inside. I'll zoom out here real quick so you can see. On the inside of our door for our left-hand door for Evolution Elite, and on the inside of our right-hand door for LOV models, I'll zoom back in here. You can see that we have a nice little diagram sticker right here that shows exactly how I just assembled the inside of that filter pan. So if you forget in today's demonstration, be sure to check the inside of your door. And then for LOV models, it'll be right here. And that will give you an idea of the filter pan assembly going back together. And if that still doesn't get it for you, like I mentioned earlier with the O-rings, be sure to check out the Henny Penny Help YouTube channel because we have lots of instructional videos on that as well. That brings me to our recap. So we covered a lot of things today. And to make sure that we take away, we talked about express and auto filtration and why that's important. We know that comes up a lot throughout the day, but as we had mentioned, the reason it's critical and it's important to do those express or auto filtrations, and our goal should be 0 skips, is because we talked about some of the consequences that can result from that, because naturally those crumbs are just going to continue to build up inside that fry pot. It's going to likely lead to clogged drain valves, and at bare minimum, it's going to reduce our oil life, and the oil can be very costly. As well as if it does end up resulting to a service call from a drain brush getting caught in there, then those can be very costly as well. So we talked about how important it is for the auto and the express filtration. The other item we talked about was daily maintenance filter. We talked about starting each day with a new clean filter pad. That's the time that that's going to be done. And then also we talked about some of the areas to pay special attention to when we're doing that, because what we can do is we can alleviate some of those nuisance high limit E10 error codes that we could see on our control panels. And if we're making sure that we're removing that black carbon buildup during these times, or at least helping prevent it from building up, then this is going to help reduce the amount of E10s that we see. Because like we had mentioned before, just because we see an E10 on our control panel does not necessarily mean that that component is bad. It could simply mean that there's a bunch of black carbon buildup on there, giving it an inaccurate reading. So we would want to try cleaning that first before we called for a service call. The other thing we talked about was filter pan maintenance. Filter pan maintenance, remember, we talked about 3 crucial things. Was going to be a properly assembled filter pan, because remember, we talked about if we swap that filter pad and that woven filter screen, it can act just like a clogged filter pad. So we want to make sure that's put together correctly. And we also talked about the importance of a clean filter pad, as well as the O-rings. The O-rings are absolutely crucial to your fryer being able to bring that oil up like it should be, especially in the time that it's expected to do it in. So if we see our fryer pumping up slowly, 2 things we want to check first are going to be our O-rings and then also a clogged filter pad. And again, keep in mind, we want to make sure that we're wearing the proper PPE clothing, because these items would be hot if we just got done filtering. Also, we talked about a proactive measure that we could take in terms of going into our busy times during our lunch rush or maybe during our dinner rush. We talked about walking by and hitting our F button on our controls to check out the remaining cooks that we have. And remember, if we're getting low on those amounts, then we can go ahead and go into the filter menu and do our express or our auto filter. And the great thing is it's going to reset all those so that when we go into those busy times, we start off with the fullest amount of cook drops available. And also, like I had mentioned, that goes hand in hand with that. If we stagger our cooks throughout all those vats instead of on just maybe 1 or 2, that's going to even take that much further in terms of the fryer not prompting to go ahead and filter now. There's a possibility that we could breeze through a lunch rush or a dinner rush with not even having to filter if we do those 2 items. So that's something to keep in mind. And then also remember that the #1 contributor to E10 high limit errors is that black carbon buildup. So that's also going to equate to reduction in oil life as well. So we want to make sure when we're doing our daily maintenance filters and then also our clean outs and our deep cleans with degreasers, that we're paying a little extra attention to those areas where the high limit is, as we showed on the different models just a few moments ago. So that brings us towards the end of our training, and don't leave just yet, because we have a poll question for you, and then we're going to jump into a few minutes of answering your questions for you. And if you have any comments, feel free to leave those in the chat box as well. As I had mentioned before, we do have the Henny Penny Help YouTube channel. So if anything that you would like to reference from today's training, you can actually go back and watch this training later on, or you can check out some of our operational or troubleshooting videos that we have on that channel. And keep in mind, if you don't see what you're looking for there right now, we are constantly adding new videos each and every week. So be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications, because when those videos come out in the future, you'll be aware of them.